In this module, we're going to be talking about the writings of John. We'll begin with the Gospel. Thinking about the Gospel of John, there's very little dispute that John was written by the Apostle, also known as John, of course. Theophilus of Antioch in about 181 A.D. was the first to ascribe the Gospel to John. And there are other quotes from the Gospel of John that indicate that that's authority, that it's from him, that are even earlier than that. We know some things from the internal evidence of the Gospel itself. Of course, John seemingly refers to himself as the beloved disciple. That's mentioned several times at the Last Supper, for instance, chapter 13, verse 23, when there's the beloved disciple is also at the cross with Mary, and that's in chapter 19, verse 26. And then, of course, at the empty tomb, he's the one who gets outrun by Peter to the tomb, or outruns Peter, I should say, in chapter 20, verse 2 through 9. Also, none of those mention John by name. They just all say the beloved disciple, or the disciple whom Jesus loved. And so the fact that John is not mentioned anywhere by name in the Gospel seems to indicate that that was John's way of referring to himself. Now, some might dispute that, especially given the fact that John had a reputation of being one of the sons of thunder. But I think that certainly is a testimony to the change that John's association with Jesus brought about in his life, that he went from somebody who was known as a son of thunder, a hothead, if you will, to being known as the apostle of love. And certainly that comes through in many of his writings, in the letters as well as the gospel. Now, we're assuming probably that was written, that John was written, the gospel was written from Ephesus. The traditional view seems to indicate that's the case, and that John had gone to Ephesus as an outbreak, at the outbreak of the Jewish War that occurred in 66 to 70 A.D. And Irenaeus, one of the early church fathers, is the one who basically said that John wrote the gospel while living in Ephesus. Now, when you think about the background, John is very different than the other gospels, and some of that has to do with the background. John is writing this in a Hellenistic world, and he seems to borrow terminology from some of the relevant writers of his day. Philo being one of those, who was a Jewish historian, and the entire concept of logos is mentioned a lot by Philo. Logos is the word, and so when you read in the beginning of John, in the beginning was the Word was with God. That word logos in Greek is a borrowed concept from Stoicism, and their concept of word was this principal reality. And it was the medium of creation and governance. And so John uses that language to communicate to a Hellenistic world who Jesus was. And so I think that there's some language borrowing there that kind of gives a little bit of insight into what John's doing. Also, there seems to be in the Gospel of John some subtleties in terms of John directing comments against Gnosticism. There's certainly Gnosticism is a Neoplatonic thought process that basically sees a very dualistic nature, where good is tied to the spiritual, and that negative and evil is tied to the material. And so this dualism can be seen a little bit in some of the things that John writes, or maybe speaking against it. In terms of the synoptics and John's relationship to the synoptics, it's interesting to note that the Gospel of John omits narrative parables. It omits the Transfiguration, the Lord's Supper, and many of Jesus' pithy sayings, the things that he says, that kind of the little sermonettes that Jesus does. These things are omitted primarily in the Gospel of John. The themes that are central to the synoptics seem to have disappeared in the Gospel of John. But John does include a fair bit of material that is not found in the synoptics. Like, for instance, all of chapters 1 through 5 are unique to the Gospel of John. Jesus' visits to Jerusalem, his raising Lazarus from the dead, and some of the extended discourses, such as what occurs in John 13, 14, 15. These are things that are included in John, but they're not included in the other synoptic Gospels. And so the other thing about John that's interesting is that Jesus is explicitly identified with God in the Gospel of John, whereas the other synoptics are a little bit more, they kind of speak around it a little bit, but don't identify him immediately right as God as John does. In terms of dating the Gospel of John, it's any date really between 55 and 95 AD is possible for the writing of John. It probably was written sometime around 80 to 85 AD after the fall of Jerusalem. The earliest fragments that exist are from John chapter 18, and they date to AD 130. So we have really, really old pieces of fragments of the Gospel of John that are still in existence today. So thinking about that, in terms of the purpose of the Gospel of John, certainly John himself writes in chapter 20, verse 31, that he is writing so that people might believe. And so interestingly enough, he's not writing so much about who is Jesus, but really more about who is the Messiah, the Christ, who is the Son of God. And whereas the synoptics are answering the question, who's this Jesus guy? John is answering the question, well, who is the Messiah? And so that little subtle difference, I think, gives some interesting insight into the way that the Gospel of John is constructed, and I think also provides us, with an insight into even why many times I think we find it very helpful to have someone read the Gospel of John before they do anything else when they're first coming to faith. Now, if we move on to John's other letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, these are primarily written to warn about false teachings. We don't know much about the opponents that John is writing against. We know that from things we can glean from the letters themselves that these opponents denied that Jesus was the Christ. They also disbelieved that the Messiah was human, that Jesus was human, and that Christ had come actually in the flesh. They denied that they were in some sense themselves, that is, dominated by sin or even subject to sin. We know that from chapter 1, verse 6. We also know their conduct was haughty, loveless, and schismatic. And so it seems to be that perhaps some early forms of Gnosticism and maybe even Docetism lie in the background of John's letters. As I described already, Gnosticism has to do with this dichotomy between matter being evil, flesh being evil, and spirit being good. And then Docetism basically rejected the incarnation of Christ. And so Jesus could not have become flesh because flesh is evil. And so maybe he could temporarily assume flesh, but he couldn't become flesh. In other words, so there are different variations on that. Maybe Jesus, came down at a certain point and filled the body of Christ and then left at some point, or perhaps was just an aberration. They had all kinds of variations to that, but they could not imagine Jesus as the Son of God in the flesh, because that just would go against what they taught. Cerinthus was a guy who was one of the proponents of this, and in fact there's quotes from the early church fathers about John, about Cerinthus being an opponent of John, and John feeling very strongly about this guy. Cerinthus taught that Jesus came upon, that basically Jesus became into the physical body of Jesus at baptism and then left him on the cross, so that he didn't suffer. He left the physical Jesus to suffer, but that the actual Son of God part of him came and left at baptism and then left before the crucifixion. John, of course, was vehemently opposed to that, and certainly you see some rumblings of that, I think, in his letters. One other interesting nuance when it comes to thinking about John's letters, some have proposed, and I think Johnson actually in your textbook says this, is that perhaps 3rd John was a personal letter of commendation to the elders that these three letters were written together. That John, 3rd John, was a personal letter of recommendation to the elders of the congregation. That 2nd John was actually a cover letter to the church, and then 1st John was the actual letter that he was writing. And it seems that might make sense. I like that as an explanation as to how those three made it into the canon. Certainly, reading 3rd John or even 2nd John, you kind of wonder, scratch your head sometimes as to, well, why was that one? Why is that in there? Why is it necessary? But if those things came together as a group, that would make sense. So I think it gives a little bit of insight into understanding John's letters.